In August of 1889, a six-man survey team dispatched by the General Land Office in Washington entered the interior of the Ozark Plateau in southern Missouri, with instructions to complete a cadastral survey of approximately 40 square miles of public land in Ozark County, land that had been identified for potential timber lease and had not yet been formally mapped to the standard required for disposition. The team was led by a deputy surveyor named Robert Cale, who had completed 11 previous survey assignments for the General Land Office across Missouri and Arkansas without incident. His field record was, by the standards of the period, exemplary. His notebooks from earlier assignments are in the National Archives, and they are methodical, precise, and complete. The notebooks of a man who had been doing this work long enough to do it without thinking about it, whose habits were so ingrained that he recorded the same categories of information in the same sequence on every page. He was accompanied by 5 chainmen and a note-keeper, whose names appear in the assignment paperwork filed in Washington before departure. They were expected back in the town of Gainesville, the county seat, within 3 weeks. They did not come back in 3 weeks. They did not come back at all. I came to this the way I come to most things, looking for something else, finding this in the margin of what I was actually after. I was tracing the land disposition records of Ozark County during the timber boom years, trying to understand why certain parcels in the county's interior had never been formally surveyed despite multiple assignment attempts between 1878 and 1905. The General Land Office records for Missouri during this period are held at the National Archives in Kansas City, and the timber disposition files are voluminous and well organized, which makes gaps stand out more clearly than they would in a less complete collection. The Ozark County interior parcels showed a consistent pattern: survey ordered, team dispatched, no survey returned, no formal explanation filed, parcel held in suspense status. I counted 7 separate assignment attempts across 27 years. None produced a completed survey. The 1889 Cale expedition was the 4th of those 7, and it was the only one from which something came back. I want to describe what I mean by no formal explanation filed, because in a record system as thorough as the General Land Office is, that phrase is not as ordinary as it sounds. When a survey assignment failed, when a team returned without completing the work, there was a mandatory reporting protocol. The deputy surveyor filed a field report explaining the failure. The equipment was accounted for. The time was logged, and the case was closed or reassigned. This happened routinely across hundreds of failed assignments in the Missouri and Arkansas districts during this period. Equipment failure, illness, terrain, flooding. The explanations vary, but the explanations exist. They are in the files. You can read them. For the 7 Ozark County interior assignments, the pattern is different. 4 of the 7 have assignment paperwork, the team, the equipment issued, the date of departure, and then nothing. No field report, no equipment accounting, no closure notation. The assignment simply ends, and the next assignment begins some years later with a new team and new equipment, as if the previous one had not happened, or as if the person making the next assignment had not read the file before making it. That is the pattern across 27 years and 7 teams. And the 1889 Cale expedition is the only one from which something came back. One note, found 11 days after the team was last seen, folded inside the cover of the survey notebook, at the edge of a dry creek bed approximately 4 miles from where the team's camp had been established. By the time this reaches you, disappearances in remote terrain in the 19th century American interior are familiar enough that they do not automatically suggest anything unusual. Survey teams worked in unmapped country, under difficult conditions, with equipment and provisions that failed, in territory where an accident could be fatal, and a wrong turn could mean days of disorientation before anyone came looking. Disappearances happened, and most of them have explanations that are ordinary and sad and do not require anything beyond the known hazards of the work. I know that. I have read enough of these files to know that. I want to be clear from the start that I am not building to a sensational conclusion because I do not have one. What I have is a paper trail that raises questions I cannot close, a note whose contents have never been published, and a pattern of institutional behavior around the Ozark County interior parcels that I have not been able to explain by reference to any ordinary administrative logic. Because the note itself is the first problem. The General Land Office maintained a protocol for handling materials recovered from failed survey expeditions, equipment, notebooks, personal effects, and that protocol required that recovered materials be itemized, forwarded to the Washington office, and held in the expedition's file pending any formal inquiry. In the case of the 1889 Cale expedition, the recovered notebook is listed in the itemization filed by the Ozark County Sheriff's Office, which conducted the search. The notebook is listed. The note found inside the notebook cover is listed as a separate item, described in the sheriff's itemization as one folded paper, handwritten, contents unknown. Contents unknown, meaning the sheriff's deputy who found it listed it without reading it. That is standard practice. The General Land Office protocol specified that expedition materials were to be forwarded unopened to Washington rather than examined in the field. The notebook arrived in Washington. The arrival is logged in the General Land Office Incoming Materials Register for October of 1889. A routine entry, the kind made for hundreds of incoming items per month, giving the date, the item description, and the originating office. The note is not listed separately in the incoming register. Either it was not forwarded with the notebook, or it arrived with the notebook and was separated from it on receipt, reviewed by someone, and placed somewhere other than the case file. The notebook itself was filed in the expedition's case file. The case file is in the National Archives in Kansas City. I have requested it, and I have read it. The notebook is there. The note is not. That is the part I keep returning to, because the absence has a shape. The itemization says it was found. The sheriff's protocol says it should have been forwarded. The incoming register does not show it arriving separately. The case file does not contain it. Something that was documented as existing simply does not appear in the place where the forwarding chain says it should be. That is not the same as being lost. Lost things leave a different kind of trace. Consider the notebook itself, because it is what I have, and it is more than it first appears. Survey notebooks of this period follow a strict format. The deputy surveyor records bearings, distances, corner descriptions, and field notes in a structured sequence that allows any subsequent reader to reconstruct the survey's progress on the ground. The Cale notebook covers 8 days of work before it stops. The last entry is dated August 19, 1889. The entries through August 17th are routine and legible. Corner descriptions, bearing notations, a note about a spring encountered on the survey line, a note about terrain becoming more difficult. Reading them, you get a sense of a team doing ordinary work in ordinary conditions. The handwriting is steady. The notations are complete. There is no sign, in the first 7 days of the notebook, that anything is wrong. The August 18th entry is shorter than the preceding ones and contains a phrase that Cale used to mark an interruption to the survey day: weather delay. He used the same phrase on 3 earlier occasions in the notebook, each time following it with a notation about conditions improving and work resuming later in the same day or the next morning. On August 18th, there is no such follow-on notation. The entry ends with weather delay and the date, and the August 19th entry begins on the next line with no resumption notation between them. That gap is small. On its own, it means very little. But it is the first thing in the notebook that does not fit the pattern of everything before it. The August 19th entry contains 4 lines. The first line gives a bearing and a distance. The second line describes a landmark, a rock formation, described in terms that suggest it was being used as a reference point for a bearing. The third line begins a sentence and does not complete it. The sentence, as far as it goes, describes a sound, not a bearing, not a terrain feature, not any of the notations that belong in a survey notebook. A sound described in 2 words before the sentence stops. The fourth line is a single word that Cale's handwriting renders ambiguously, and which I have looked at under magnification and shown to 2 other readers, and which all 3 of us have read differently. I read it as a direction, the word east or west, the kind of notation a surveyor makes when recording which way he is going. One of the other readers read it as a surname, possibly the name of one of the chainmen. The third reader, who has more experience with General Land Office notebooks from this period than either of us, read it as the beginning of a verb that was never finished. The sentence in the third line was not completed. The fourth line is ambiguous, and then the notebook ends. There was no distress marker left at the camp, which the search party noted and found unusual. Survey teams of this period were expected to mark their camp location with a flagged stake and a notation in the notebook if they departed for any reason, a standard precaution in terrain where rescue would depend on knowing where to start looking. The search party, assembled by the Ozark County Sheriff and consisting of 12 men who spent 9 days in the field, found the camp on the second day of searching. The sheriff's report of the search, which is in the Ozark County Courthouse records and which I obtained through a request to the Missouri State Archives, describes the camp in language I have read many times. Fire ring, cold, bedrolls in place, equipment laid in order, food stores present, partially consumed but not significantly reduced from what a provision team would have carried for the first 8 days of a 3-week assignment. The cooking pot was on the fire ring, not packed. 1 pair of boots was found inside a tent, which the sheriff's report noted as unusual. A man who intended to leave camp, for any reason, would put on his boots. That is the part I keep returning to separately from the note. Camps in that condition do not read like accidents. An accident, a fall, a flash flood, a sudden medical emergency, leaves different traces. Scrambled equipment, things knocked over, evidence of a departure in haste or distress. The boots inside the tent suggest a man who did not intend to go anywhere. The cold fire ring suggests time had passed. The ordered equipment suggests nothing violent had happened in the camp itself. The sheriff's report uses the word orderly twice. Orderly camp, abandoned. And then the search covered approximately 12 square miles over 9 days and found no remains, no additional equipment, no evidence of where the 6 men had gone after leaving the camp. They found the notebook at the dry creek bed, 4 miles from camp, with the note inside the cover. They found nothing else. I want to pause here and account for what I am not claiming, because the framework of a story like this invites certain conclusions that the evidence does not support. 6 men disappearing in the Ozark interior in 1889 could mean many things. The terrain was genuinely difficult. The weather records for Ozark County in August of 1889, which I obtained from the Missouri State Weather Bureau's archival records, show an unusual precipitation pattern for that month. A dry period followed by 2 days of heavy rain in mid-August, which would be consistent with flash flooding in the creek drainages of the interior plateau. A flood event could explain a sudden departure from camp and could explain why no remains were found in a 9-day search of 12 square miles. It could explain the cold fire ring and the provisions left behind. It could even explain why the notebook ended up at a dry creek bed 4 miles from camp, carried there by the flood or carried there by someone fleeing it. I want to be honest about that. I have followed that explanation as far as I can take it, and it is not impossible. What it does not explain is the note's absence from the case file. A flood explains the disappearance. It does not explain the note being listed in the itemization and not arriving in Washington. Those are separate questions, and the flood answers the first and leaves the second completely untouched. And the flood does not explain the pattern. A single failed expedition in difficult terrain is a tragedy and an administrative nuisance. 7 failed expeditions over 27 years on the same parcels from which no completed survey ever emerged is something else. The General Land Office's records show that during the same 27-year period, every other parcel in Ozark County's inventory was successfully surveyed. Many of them in terrain described by the surveyors themselves as more challenging than the interior plateau parcels. Other survey assignments in Missouri and Arkansas during this period show failure rates below 5%, even in difficult country. The failure rate on these specific parcels is 100% across 7 attempts. I put those 2 numbers next to each other, and I could not explain away what they said. The parcels in question were never surveyed, never formally disposed of, and were eventually absorbed into the Mark Twain National Forest in 1939, at which point their status changed from public land held in suspense to federal forest land, and the survey requirement was administratively retired. They are national forest land today. No one will survey them for timber disposition because the disposition question no longer exists. Whatever the obstacle was, natural, administrative, or something else, it is now permanently moot. There is one additional document I found in the case file that I have not yet described, and I want to describe it carefully because it is easy to overread. It is a letter from the General Land Office's Surveyor General for Missouri, written in November of 1889, to the office's director in Washington. The letter discusses the Cale expedition's failure and the loss of the team, and it expresses the appropriate condolences and administrative concerns. And then, in the final paragraph, it recommends that the interior plateau parcels be placed in indefinite suspense status pending, as the letter says, a determination of the suitability of the terrain for cadastral operations. That phrase, suitability of the terrain, is not standard language in General Land Office correspondence. I have read enough of these letters to say that, with some confidence. The standard phrase for a terrain challenge was difficulty of access or hazardous conditions or terrain requiring specialized equipment. Those phrases describe a practical obstacle. Suitability suggests something different. Suitability is the language you use when the question is not whether the terrain is hard to reach, but whether it is the kind of place that should be surveyed at all. Whether the undertaking itself is appropriate. Whether something about the terrain makes it unsuitable in a way that transcends the practical. I have read that paragraph many times, and I want to be honest. I do not know what the Surveyor General meant by it. He may have meant nothing more than that the terrain had proved unexpectedly dangerous, and that further assignments would be premature until more was understood. That is a reasonable reading. But I have not been able to find any subsequent correspondence in which the determination of suitability was made. Any report in which someone analyzed the terrain and concluded either that it was or was not suitable. Any closure of the question the Surveyor General raised. The parcels were placed in suspense status. They stayed there for 50 years. The determination was apparently never made, or was made somewhere I have not found, or was made and the result was to leave the question permanently open. The parcels were never surveyed, never formally disposed of, and were eventually absorbed into the Mark Twain National Forest in 1939, at which point their status changed from public land held in suspense to federal forest land, and the survey requirement was administratively retired. They are national forest land today. No one will survey them for timber disposition because the disposition question no longer exists. Whatever the obstacle was, natural, administrative, or something else, it is now permanently moot. The question the Surveyor General raised in November of 1889 was resolved not by being answered, but by being made irrelevant. What they found in those 40 square miles, or what found them, is in a note that exists in a single document as a listed item and nowhere else in the world. Someone read it. Someone decided where it would go. And where it went was not into the file. If you know someone who asks the right questions about public land records, share this with them. That is all.